Okay, so we're going to get started talking about Sapelo, but let me warn you from the beginning that history is just a soap opera. It's a lot about who did what to whom. And when we're talking about Sapelo, there's as much myth as there is fact. And you're going to hear me say several times throughout the night, and that's another story, because I don't have time to tell you everything. But what I'm hoping is that I will pique your interest, and you'll want to do a little bit more research. And if you haven't ever been, go visit. How many of y'all have been to Sapelo Island? Oh, good. Good. Then hopefully this will bring back some memories. If you know something I didn't say, feel free to participate. Raise your hand. We'll get it in. So, as Rita said, I'm the docent coordinator for Friends of Sapelo. That's our support organization for Sapelo Island. And so under that, it was my job to train and lead the docents for the Christmas holiday tours. Anybody ever done the Christmas holiday tours at Sapelo? We haven't been able to do them for the past 2 years, obviously, because of COVID. The issue is the limitation on the ferry, because there are so many people who work on Sapelo and have to come back and forth, or live on Sapelo and work on the mainland, that we can't add 35 tour group members every day to the ferry. So we're hoping that eventually next year maybe we'll be able to go back and do the holiday tours. But they are doing some limited things. So check out their website and take the opportunity to go visit. And hopefully after tonight you'll really, really, really want to go. All right, so Sapelo is one of 14 barrier islands off the coast of Georgia. And it's located pretty much right smack dab in the middle of our 100-mile coast. It is... this is where I always have to have my numbers with me. It's about 16,500 acres. It's the fourth largest of the 14 barrier islands, about 11 miles long and about a mile wide. So just giving you our location there, right smack dab in the middle of the coastline. And the state of Georgia owns 97% of the island today. And Sapelo today is really a hodgepodge of government bureaucracy. Anything that we try to do on the island, we refer to it as on island time times government bureaucracy to the fourth power. And the overall head agency of that would be the DNR, the Department of Natural Resources. So there is an island manager who works for DNR who kind of coordinates it all together. And then under that is SINAR, or as people who read our name tags usually say, what is center? But SINAR is Sapelo Island National Estuary Reserve. And I'll tell you what all that means as we go through this. And then under that is Ugami. Now, when I first started going over to Sapelo and they kept talking about Ugami, I thought that was the people that were like the Geechee. No, Ugami is University of Georgia Marine Institute. And then there's the R.J. Reynolds State Park. The actual mansion on the south end is now a state historic site, and it's operated by the Georgia State Park system. So beyond this, you then have NOAA, Oceanic and Atmospheric Association, and all those. There's the R.J. Reynolds Wildlife Area and all these other groups. But these are kind of the main ones that coordinate and run Sapelo today. Now, Native American presence on Sapelo dates back some 4,500 years. We have artifacts, predominantly fired pottery, that tells us that the Wally Indians, and the Wally were part of the Lower Creek, were here thousands and thousands of years ago. And we believe that they came up from Florida, settled on the barrier islands, mostly all the barrier islands, and you've probably heard about the Wally before. And they established towns and ceremonial sites. They weren't always here. Many of the groups were migratory because evidence tells us that people weren't really living there full time. They came for certain times of the year, harvest and festivals. So they were kind of like the early snowbirds. But they left behind shell rings and middens and evidence of their presence. Now, a shell ring is exactly what it sounds like. It's a great big giant ring made up of shells. Mostly it would have been oyster shells, clam shells, mussel shells, and it pretty much was a landfill because their diet was predominantly on seafood, particularly the crustaceans and such. And so what do you do with the shells? You throw them in a landfill. And so they began to use this to mark areas. And there are several shell rings up on the north end of the island particularly, and the largest of these was about 12 feet wide, and it encompassed about 200 feet in diameter. And they believed that there were structures, houses and such within that circle, and that people would come and stay in that shell ring during ceremonial times. Most of the shell rings disappeared in the 18th and 19th century because the people living on Sapelo at that time came and got the shells to make tabby. So it all got, for the most part, got recycled into tabby. But if you'll look at, does the laser thing on it work? Oops, what did I do? Okay. I guess not. But in this top picture here, they are walking through a path that's been cut through the shell midden. So when you go, it's not really just a giant pile of shells because that's been thousands of years, and dirt and vegetation and trees have all grown there. But you can see all the little white dots. Those are the shells in the shell midden. So there were several settlements on Sapelo Island, and they date back to before the pyramids. These shell rings and middens are older than the pyramids of Egypt. And so kind of makes us think the Wali were here and these were Georgia's first city. The large ring, if occupied, the largest of the rings, would hold anywhere from 35 to 120 people. So they would, again, come there, ceremonial purposes, hang out for whatever festivals and harvesting they were doing. And eventually, the Spanish arrive. And we have the Spanish mission period. Spanish soldiers and missionaries came up from St. Augustine and began to settle on the barrier islands of Georgia. And Franciscan, mostly, missions were established across the islands, particularly on St. Catherine's and on Sapelo Island, and of course on St. Simon's and such. The Spanish ceramics were found within the Wali settlements, so that tells us that the Spanish and the Wali Indians did trade with each other and interact with each other, as we depict here in this cute little picture. The large mission on Sapelo was the San Jose de Zabala. Zabala, Z-A-P-A-L-A, is the Spanish variation of Sapelo. So you'll see the word Zabala all through literature about Sapelo. And so this mission was up on the north end near the shell rings because that was a good location for landing your boats and your ships and such as that. And they established agriculture here. They planted fruit trees and had set up a pretty sophisticated community. And artifacts from this area tell us that they were in contact with the people back in Europe. This medallion in the top right corner can be traced back to having once been at the Vatican. It was a commemorative thing that came from the Vatican. So it lets us know that the missionaries who were settling here on Sapelo did have contact with people back in Europe. And we have all these are all different glass beads and buttons and such that have been found in the mission sites and in the Wali sites. Again, letting us know that they did trade with each other. So the Spanish were eventually chased out by pressure from the soldiers who were being sent over to Charleston. And there were, in fact, let me back up whilst I talk about that. There were several rebellions and revolts between different Wali tribes, the mainland Walis and the island Walis. Does that sound familiar? The mainland and the islands had a big conflict. And the Spanish got involved, and one chieftain was overthrowing the other chieftain. But that's another story. You can find a lot of research on that if you read Buddy Sullivan. And so the Spanish eventually their presence just kind of faded away on the island, and the British show up. So Georgia's established as a British colony, 1733. We all know James Oglethorpe came and took over the area and set this up, and that included all of the islands. Things that y'all probably familiar with, when Oglethorpe got here, he had an interpreter and a liaison named Mary Musgrove. Now, Mary Musgrove was Yakima Indian and English. Her father was an English trader. Her mother was a Yakima Native American. And he was a trader. She eventually married an Englishman who was also a trader. They ran a trade port. And so because she had the language and the culture of both, she was a great help to Oglethorpe when he was here. But then Musgrove and Oglethorpe got into a bit of a land dispute because, as we know, many of the treaties were worded weirdly or just simply not followed. And there was one treaty that said, yeah, all the islands will belong to the Native Americans. And then, of course, the British didn't pay any attention to that. So Mary Musgrove led a movement to get the islands given back to the Native Americans, the Wally and such. And eventually, new governor was sent to Georgia, and he said, let's just end this. He gave St. Catherine's to Mary Musgrove, and they sold Sapelo, and they gave her the money for it. So that was kind of how they resolved this. It's like, okay, you can have these 2 islands. We're going to take the other 12, and we'll call it quits. So the British were here, and they didn't do much on Sapelo, really not much of a presence there, because the French showed up. After the French Revolution, or actually during the French Revolution, several French aristocrats were fleeing the revolution, and they wound up over here. This was a good place to come start over. So the French Sapelo Company was formed, and there were 6 Frenchmen who came in together and owned property on the island, but were very unsuccessful in their attempt to colonize it and create plantations. Now, I usually refer to them as the 6 drunk Frenchmen. They had bad luck from the very beginning. They're headed over here, and their ship with all their supplies and their money sinks. So they show up on Sapelo almost destitute. But they do get established, and they begin to build some farms and establish a communal living space and such. But then they fought the whole time. One of the investors had sent his nephew ahead of him with all his money. The nephew was supposed to come, go to Savannah, get him a place to live and set up so that when he got here, he could live in Savannah and manage his land on Sapelo. Well, the nephew squandered all the money. The uncle gets here, and he's got a 1-room squalid little place that he's supposed to live in Savannah. And he said, this isn't going to work. So he goes over to Sapelo, gets into a huge fight with the nephew. They have a duel, and the uncle is killed. By this time, the Frenchmen have kind of had it. One of the Frenchmen, D'Avignon, he said, I've had enough of this. And because these gentlemen had also bought land here on Jekyll. So he worked out a deal. I'll give y'all all my land in Sapelo, y'all give me Jekyll, and we'll just call it quits, and we won't bother each other anymore. So that's how he got over here to Jekyll. So it wasn't a successful French Sapelo company. They did build some tabby structures up on the north end. If you've ever taken the north end tour, very interesting to go up there and see, and I recommend you do that if you haven't. By this time, the British have been, the French have arrived, the Wally decided they're leaving. They've had enough of dealing with the white men and such, and for the most part, the Wally community moves back down to St. Augustine, and that they kind of settled there. So we really don't have much of a presence on Sapelo of them from the mid-1700s. Okay? So our Frenchmen ranged between the age of 36 to 63. Some of them were a little more successful in getting settled on Sapelo than others. They did plant fruit orchards. They planted cotton. They were doing lumber, particularly the live oak, because, you know, the live oak are best for building ships. So they were harvesting that. Some of them began to build their own homes, particularly created the plantation of chocolat. Now, mostly we call it chocolate today, but it comes from a Wally word that refers to a bird that lived on the north end of the island, the chucoluta, or chocolat, which became chocolate. Now, there are a lot of different stories about how that name got derived, and you can research that, but I like that one. And so Chocolate on the north end still has a lot of those tabby ruins from our 6 Frenchmen. One of the Frenchmen, and this is where my French really fails me, Dumousset de la Voix. Anyway, this guy, he has built a plantation on High Point, which is the highest point of elevation on the island, and then gets yellow fever and dies. And his vault, this is his actual stone vault that he was buried in, was brought over to the Sapelo Visitor Center and is on display there. So if you've ever been there where you catch the ferry for Sapelo, at the Visitor Center you can go in and see his tomb. And Tabby Barn established. I actually took this picture while I was on the North End tour. And some of the tabby ruins that are there. We go up, as Friends of Sapelo, part of what we do is maintenance on the island. So 2 or 3 times a year we go up and we spray and we trim and we clear out vegetation and try to keep these as clean as we can. So if you're into that kind of thing, talk to me. So then the next big guy to show up, and this is really where, in my opinion, Sapelo history kind of takes off, is Thomas Spalding. Now, you may be familiar with Thomas Spalding. His father was an immigrant from Scotland, came and lived in the town of Frederica on St. Simon's, where Spalding was born. Spalding's mother was a Mackintosh from Darien, so he had quite the colonial Georgia pedigree. Well, actually, by now we're a state. He had quite the pedigree. And Spalding purchased parts of Sapelo Island to establish his coastal plantation. Now, he had plantations all up and down the coast of Georgia and in the middle Georgia. His main plantation was on the mainland near Darien, Ashantilly. So if you're familiar with Ashantilly, that was also Thomas Spalding's land. So he was a very innovative and resourceful man. He was involved in Georgia state politics. He also served as a U.S. representative for Georgia in Congress, where he met some other fairly influential men. It is said that while he was in Washington, he visited Thomas Jefferson at Monticello. And they exchanged letters about agriculture and experimentation and those type of things. And he was influenced a good bit by Thomas Jefferson. And he wrote articles for farm journals and other scientific reviews. And his ideas about farming and his philosophy on preserving nature and such were influential worldwide, not just the United States, but traveled through scientific circles in Europe also. So one of the main things, we bought the island in 1802, and his 2 main crops were sea island cotton, that long fiber cotton that makes a much softer cloth, and sugar cane. He was the first to grow sugar cane in Georgia. And another significant achievement of his was he refined the recipe, so to speak, for tabby. And people had been building tabby like the Frenchmen, but under Spalding, he kind of created a new and improved way to do it, using equal parts of shells, whether they be oyster, clam, mussel, lime, which is burnt shells, sand, water. And what he did was he would have them build wooden frames, and he would make molds of tabby bricks. So it wasn't just a big tabby solid wall. I don't know if you've seen tabby ruins enough to realize it's actually bricks, much like a cinder block building. And the tabby would be built, and then what you would do is you would whitewash over that, because tabby buildings, the shells didn't show, like the barn we saw, the smooth sides. Whereas here now we always know it's faux tabby, like my condo, because it's just some shells and some cement on the wall, right? But it's cute. It's okay. So Spalding became well known for his use of tabby, and like I said, he wrote these journals and things that spread these ideas, and it greatly influenced the use of tabby all up and down the coast. He practiced crop rotation. He experimented with crops, bringing new and different things to Georgia to see what would grow. He grew indigo and olives, oranges, and experimented with a lot of this. At Sapelo, on the south end, there are still some orange trees. Their fruit is very, very sour. We call them the sour orange trees, but they're still there. So when we're there visiting, oftentimes when people go on walks, they'll pick some oranges and bring them back. And these, you know, originate way back. Not the same original trees, but you know, the oranges. So Spalding was one of the largest producers of sugar cane. He designed and built a sugar mill out of tabby and exported it all over the country and even across the world. Behind this white fence is the ruins, what's left of the sugar mill, and it's very clear to see the block formation of the tabby in those ruins. And it's also located next to a building called Long Tabby. This was a building we'll talk about. This is a building we'll talk about several times as we go through this. So Long Tabby is out where the sugar mills used to be. And it's called that because it's a very long building made out of tabby. And again, I talked about the Sea Island cotton. So Spalding needs to build a house. He buys the island in 1802, and in 1806, he decides it's time to build a house. Now, Spalding had 16 children, 8 of which lived to adulthood. Okay, so that's a pretty good ratio in the early 1800s. So he builds what comes to be known as the South End house. He designs it himself. It's made of tabby, and it's got a Palladian style, much like the house his friend Thomas Jefferson built. So there are a lot of those influences that you see in the South End house that Spalding built from Monticello. And there was the center wing, tabby walls 2 to 3 feet thick with a very low ceiling. Now, why do you think he had thick walls and a low ceiling? Hurricanes. In one of his journals, he says he built a house to withstand the storms and the floods because the South End house was only about a mile up from the beach. And so he wanted to make sure that this house was going to stand. And it did through many different hurricanes. So in this style, then there were the side wings. These are colonnades. Here, this is like an open hallway, a colonnade with a bedroom wing, and on the other side would be the kitchen wing, because as you know, the kitchens were separated from the main house. And so this South End house was built over the period of about 3.5 to 4 years, built by 6 slaves, 4 men and 2 boys that were part of the construction team. But the building of the South End house was overseen by Roswell King. Anybody recognize that name? He later moved north and founded a little town called Roswell, right outside Atlanta, which that's up where I grew up. And so, and I apologize if my hair's doing funky things, but this, okay. So they built the house so that they would be safe in a storm, but they would be comfortable in the heat. So when you're there, the way the doors and the windows are, and if you've ever lived, if you remember pre-air conditioning days, houses in the South were built with windows and doors across from each other to get those cross breezes, and that's how Sapelo was set up, so that you could get these nice cross breezes coming through. Okay. So, very successful planter on Sapelo, and it was based on the slave labor, and the plantation operations. There were 4 plantations on Sapelo. As they were scattered across the island, Spalding and some of his 16 sons would work the plantations, and they had about 400 slaves that lived on the island and managed the agricultural activities. Now, the head overseer for the slaves under Thomas Spalding was a guy named Bulala. Bulala was an educated, literate Muslim from West Africa. And while here on Sapelo, he kept journals written in Arabic about his life. So we learned a lot about this area, this time period, from the journals written by Bulala. And he was very well respected, not only by the slaves, but also the Spalding family. And the slaves they worked on what's called a task system, which you may be familiar means they were given a set task list. These were their jobs that had to get done, and when those were done, they could work for themselves. They would have their own little plot to grow, and they could trade vegetables, or if they had a skill, carpentry or weaving, whatever it was, they could produce what they needed to, were required to for the plantation, and then they could trade with the rest. And the slaves, they lived across the island near the areas where they worked, and these developed into specific different little communities. And so all across the island, you had these different little slave towns or compounds, such as Chocolate, and then High Point that we've mentioned, Long Tabby, that's where the sugar mill workers lived, Raccoon Bluff, High Point, and Hog Hammock. Those were the main communities, and Behavior. Those were the main communities where the slaves lived near their assigned task work areas. Now, also during this time, right, Spalding had a lighthouse built. He donated land to the federal government for them to build a lighthouse because, much like what happened on St. Simon when John Cooper donated land for their lighthouse, Spalding needed his goods to be safely shipped out to sea and over to England and up the coast. So he donated land for the lighthouse in 1820, and that helped the port of Darien, ships coming in and out of there, an 80-foot high brick lighthouse on the south end. Okay? Now, in the 1850s, the Sapelo light was given a fourth order Fresnel lens. And if you're a lighthouse aficionado, you know what that means. It has to do with the physics of the prisms and bending the light and all like that. And this is a Winslow lighthouse. And again, if you're a lighthouse aficionado, that means something to you. These are some of the things I learned volunteering at the St. Simon's Lighthouse. There are people who travel around the world looking specifically for a certain architect's or engineer's lighthouse. St. Simon's is a Poe lighthouse, and people came from all over to see it. So this is a Winslow lighthouse with a fourth order Fresnel lens. Okay. Now, there was a hurricane in the 1890s that damaged the foundation of the lighthouse, so it was replaced with a steel pyramid lighthouse that operated from 1905 to 1933. And then after that, there wasn't as much shipping coming in out of Darien. So they decommissioned the lighthouse. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about it a little later on. They decommissioned the lighthouse, but don't worry, in 1998, they're going to refurbish it. All right. So the Civil War comes. The Spalding family moves off island. Oh, Thomas Spalding dies in 1851, and his sons and grandsons take over managing the island. But 1861, Civil War hits. They all pack up with about 370 of their slaves. They left a small little remnant on the island and moved back to the mainland. They went into middle Georgia and settled there to wait out the war. So the South End house falls into ruins. It's even vandalized by Union soldiers who come across the island on their march to the sea. And by the end of the Civil War, this is what it looks like. Hardly even recognizable as the house. You can see the one round window that's still there, and just total disrepair. So in the 20th century, we hit the 1900s. Much of Sapelo is sold to various investors, not as one large holding, but in small groups, various investors. In 1910, much of that was then bought up again by a group of investors from Macon. They were going to create a hunting lodge. So they come and they refurbish the South End house. So this is how it is. The Macon investors come. They make it livable again, or at least enough to be their hunting lodge. But that doesn't last long. It doesn't come out quite as nice as they wanted it to be. And so from 1865 through the 1940s, so Civil War is over. Slaves have been freed, but there was that remnant that was left on Sapelo Island, right? And so They again coalesced into these several separate African American communities. Again, Raccoon Bluff, High Point, Behavior, Hog Hammock, and they were farming for themselves. In 1870, get my right date. I think it's 1877. Freedmen were able to start buying property. So many of them were able to buy their own property there on Sapelo. So when we say the state now owns 97%, because that other 3% is still in the hands of the descendants of those freedmen. So there is still private property on Sapelo in the area of Hog Hammock. So 2 of Spalding's grandsons return. They're going to try to farm again, but they don't ever quite become successful because they don't have the slave labor, because the freedmen are now supporting themselves in these communities. In the 1910 census, there was a population of about 539 persons, and they were mostly the descendants of the 19th century slaves. So predominantly African American population. Okay. The largest of the settlements, names I've mentioned already: Raccoon Bluff, Hog Hammock, Lumber Landing, Bell Marsh, and Shell Hammock, again where they were living. And then along comes Howard Coffin. Now, Howard Coffin was, as it says, a Detroit automotive pioneer. He was vice president of the Hudson Motor Company. He and another gentleman established this automotive company. And one of the jokes we tell when we're doing the tour at the mansion is that they didn't name the company after Howard because nobody wanted to drive a coffin. Okay. So the Hudson Motor Company, but he, like Spalding, is a very innovative and resourceful man. He is definitely a Renaissance man, interested in a lot of different things, much like Spalding was. So he and his wife Matilda were visiting in Savannah for some auto races, because again, he's in the automotive industry. He visits Skidaway, thinks this is beautiful, and he starts looking for Barrier Islands. He's going, I need a southern retreat. So he visits the area, and he buys Sapelo Island in 1912, falls in love with the area, and decides he needs to have a home here. And he buys most of the island from the various people who own it. So again, he's consolidating the land under one owner, and he purchased a little over 2/3 of the island for $150,000. Now, that obviously was a lot more money back in 1912, but one of the things that puts it in perspective to me, a little personal side note here, tomorrow I'm closing on a 715 square foot cabin on an acre of land in Ellijay. I sold it for more than that. I'm like, wow, if I could have bought Sapelo for that. So he buys most of the island, and over time, in his time there, he keeps increasing his holdings. He buys up more and more of the island. With many of the private landholders who are there, he establishes a first right of refusal on the purchase of their land. When they get ready to sell their land, they have to go to him first. When the matriarchs and patriarchs of the family die out, he would go to the children and go, hey, you want to make a deal here? So over his time, he eventually takes where he owns most of the island. And he originally intended for this to be a southern retreat, but he and Matilda liked it here so much they moved here permanently. You know, when you're wealthy enough, you're able to do that, right? So he was known as the father of standardization, right up there with Henry Ford in automation. And this allowed the automotive industry to grow. Very wealthy, uses that to move to Sapelo. Okay. And he does a major gutting of the South End house. This is going to be his and Matilda's home, but they pretty much knock it down to the tabby walls. Everything is gutted out, and they keep the main structure. So the tabby walls are still there, the foundation. But he does a lot of modernization to it. He builds a basement on a barrier island. It has never flooded. Isn't that crazy? The house I grew up in North Georgia flooded all the time. But he builds a basement. He builds a second floor ballroom, and he adds an indoor and an outdoor pool. Coffin was a big health nut, and swimming was his exercise of choice. He wanted to be able to swim year-round, so he had an indoor pool and an outdoor pool. So, again, major renovations on the South End house. He, like I said, was very resourceful. In addition to agriculture, he established a cannery and a fishing industry, and they would can the fish to sell. He had a boat building industry, he had a lumber industry, commercial agriculture, and a lot of this was to employ the blacks who were still on the island. The African Americans who still lived there were all employed by Coffin. And that allowed them to maintain more time there, maintain their communities there because they were able to find employment. Okay? Now, Spalding then invites his cousin, A.W. Bill Jones, to come be overseer for the island. Y'all may recognize that name too. So he comes down and becomes his overseer, and they're working together on the island, and then they get a wild idea. Let's buy another island. So in 1926, they go and buy Sea Island, where in 1928 they opened the cloister. Now, the idea then was that the money from the cloister, that investment, would help support their lifestyle on Sapelo. And Howard and Matilda loved living on Sapelo. When I'm giving tours there, I always tell the people, if I had to pick a time period to have actually lived at the mansion, I would have lived there in the Roaring '20s with the Coffins. They were very lavish entertainers and avid outdoorsmen. In this picture, on the far right with the hat, that's Matilda. She was quite the outdoors woman, and she was one of the best shots in McIntosh County. She won all kind of shooting awards. Next to her is Coffin. Gentleman in the back with the long beard, that's Archibald McKinney. He was next to him is his wife, Sally. She is Sally Spalding McKinley. So she's Thomas Spalding's granddaughter, and she was the postmistress on the island until 1916. But here he is there at the McKinley's home visiting with them, and when McKinley's died, Coffin purchased their 100-acre farm. Also, again, that right of first refusal. And again, piecemealing the island together to pretty much under his control. Yeah. Also, around that time, he built Marsh Landing. It was a dock for his custom-built 124-foot yacht, which he named the Zapala. Okay? Beautiful yacht. And that way he had a place to dock it, could sail it right up to Sapelo when they went traveling. There were many important visitors who came to the island while Coffin was here. They very lavish entertainers. President Coolidge spends Christmas to New Year's here in 1928. Did a lot of hunting and going around. And I don't know if you know your presidential trivial history, but Coolidge was very much an introvert. Very much of a recluse. And so one of the stories is that in the second floor ballroom that Coffin built, they would have movie premieres. I mean, they would have parties and show a movie with the director and the stars from the movie there. And that when Coolidge was here, while everybody else was out having a party, he would go up to the ballroom and watch movies by himself. So he would just kind of go watch movies and not really go to the party. Charles Lindbergh visits in 1929. So Lindbergh, because again, by this time, Coffin is also involved in the aviation industry, moves from automobiles to airplanes. And so Lindbergh comes to visit, and they have a little confab about advancements in aviation. So he's on his way from Miami to Washington. So he flies in and lands in one of the fields right outside the South End mansion. Stays about 2.5 hours, has lunch with Coffin, and then gets in his plane and goes on up to Washington. But Lindbergh drops by. Then President Herbert Hoover visits in 1932. In addition, other people who were visited in this area, Henry Ford came to visit, Bobby Jones, golf pro, came to visit, and just people from all over in all walks of life. Asa Candler, y'all know Asa Candler? Coca-Cola came down for a visit. So that's the crowd, that's the world that the Coffins moved in, particularly once they opened the cloister, because people would come down to visit the cloister, would come over to Sapelo and stay with him for a while, because in those days, with as much trouble as it took to get from place to place, you stayed a while. You had these big house parties. We've seen all that in the movies, right? So they had these big house parties. So Howard and Matilda are very happy there on their little island. Everything's going great. And then in 1932, Matilda dies. She gets ill. She passes away on Sapelo Island and is buried at Christ Church, Frederica. And this was devastating to Coffin. He wasn't near as happy on Sapelo without Matilda as he was with. And so he didn't spend as much time on Sapelo after her death. And then we have he's also dealing with the financial strains of the Great Depression. And in some financial straits, he was kind of having to make a decision. Did he keep Sapelo Island and sell Sea Island, which was a money-making profit, or did he keep Sea Island and let his private retreat of Sapelo go? So, tough decision that he needed to make. Coffin dies in 1937, and he is also buried at Christ Church next to his beloved Matilda. So, looking for something to, all right, what am I going to do with this island? He is visited several times throughout the early 30s by a young man, Richard J. Reynolds, Jr., the son of Richard Reynolds of Winston-Salem tobacco fame, right? So around this time, R.J. Reynolds, Dick as he was known, decided that he would buy Sapelo Island from Howard Coffin in 1934 as his private retreat. He had come to visit in 32, he visited again in 33, and in 34 he decided to build it. To buy it. One of the stories is, and they tell me this is true, but again, that's another story. Reynolds was there visiting, and you got to remember, think about what it would have been in the 1930s. People of great wealth no longer trusted banks, and they carried most of their wealth with them in jewels and in stock certificates and bonds and such as that. And in fact, in the South End mansion, the guest rooms all have safes in the closets, so that you could lock up your jewels and your stocks and your bonds and your things you brought with you. So the story is that when Reynolds decides, yes, I'm going to buy the island, he paid $700,000 for it, threw in another $50,000 for the yacht. So for $750,000, he gets the island of Sapelo and Zapala. And the story is that he paid for it with they use the term pocket change. The wealth he had brought with him, the stocks and bonds and barriers notes and things that he had, he was able to cover most of the cost of the transaction. So, but at that time, also understand, in 1934, Reynolds was 28 years old and worth about $28 million. Think about having $28 million in 1934. So this was just going to be another playground for him. And Reynolds never lived on Sapelo full time. It really was a retreat for him and his family. Now, Reynolds is from Winston-Salem. He was once mayor. He served as mayor, and he was actually elected with a 90% plurality. Can you imagine anybody today being elected with a 90 percentile? He also was innovative and resourceful, another Renaissance man into a lot of different things. He played an integral part in the creation of Delta Airlines. They were struggling, not being able to get off the ground. He did a huge infusion of cash by buying a lot of stock, and they were able to develop into the company that they are today. And he also served as in the Pacific Theater of World War II. He was a navigator on a naval aircraft and was a well-commendated soldier. He, again, as a Renaissance man, very interested in the sea, marine science, navigation, maritime history, kind of fancied himself a pirate, as we'll see evidence of in a few minutes. And brought all this with him to Sapelo, which is why, he wants this coastal home. He's a pirate. And, of course, there are rumors that Blackbeard had been in the area because the little tiny island next to Sapelo is called Blackbeard Island. And people still think that some of that treasure is buried there. Okay. Now, Reynolds was a much better businessman than he was family man. Reynolds was married 4 times. His first wife was Elizabeth McCall Dillard, known as Blitz. They had 4 sons. That's who he was married to when he buys Sapelo. His second wife was a Hollywood starlet, Maureen O'Brien. They had 2 sons, so he had 6 sons with his first 2 wives. His third wife was Muriel Greena. They didn't have any children, and they had a very contentious marriage. By this time, he has developed emphysema, and the stories are that when he came to Sapelo without Muriel, he did quite well. But when Muriel was with him, he was often very sick. So he tended to do better when the wife wasn't there. Also, when they got divorced, he filed the papers in McIntosh County, where he had donated the gymnasium to the high school and was good friends with all the judges. And she didn't get a very good deal. So she contested the divorce, and they held another trial in McIntosh County. And once again, she didn't get a very good deal. It's also said, and one of the books that I've read is called The Gilded Leaf, and it was written by one of Reynolds' sons by his second wife, Marianne O'Brien. And it's all about his perspective of his father and his life and career and all that. So some of this, might be a little prejudicial. But one of the stories he tells is that after these first 3 divorces, the 3 ex-wives actually became good friends. Because they definitely had something in common, right? And again, that level of society and being socialites and such. So they actually then became good friends. Well, wife number 4 and his widow was Anne Marie Schmitz Reynolds. She was actually a psychiatrist. She was Dr. Anne Marie Schmidt. And she gave birth to Reynolds' only daughter 36 hours after he passed. So daughter was born posthumously. He never knew her. And again, the emphysema was really bad. And he spent the last 2 years of his life, Reynolds, in and out of hospitals and sanitariums, predominantly in Switzerland, which is where Anne Marie was from. And again, the sons from the earlier marriages, they all kind of questioned what really happened, but he died from emphysema. Okay? They kind of blamed Anne Marie. Well, during his time at the South End Mansion, several upgrades were done. He upgraded the facilities to include air conditioning. He was one of the first homes in Georgia coast to have air conditioning. And part of it was because of his emphysema. He couldn't take the humidity. And he also put a bowling alley in the basement. Second home. You remember that? Mm-hmm. To have private home to have a bowling alley. And his idea was, we need to make this a little bit grander. We need to make it a little bit more modern, a little bit more contemporary. And I actually like a lot of what Reynolds did because I'm a huge mid-century modern fan. So all these changes that he was making through the 40s and the 50s, they kind of appeal to my aesthetic. He hires Philip Schutz, an Atlanta architect. You may be familiar with him. He also did the Swan House in Atlanta, if you're familiar with that. If you don't know it as the Swan House, it was the governor's mansion in the Hunger Game movies. If you've watched this. Okay, wrong crowd for that. Okay. So Schutz comes down from Atlanta as the architect to help design the house. A lot of really artistic upgrades more than structural. And one of the things he does is he brings in this artist named Athos Minaboni to paint murals across the house. One in the solarium, one of my favorite, well, I say this about just about every room, one of my favorite rooms in the house, he painted tropical trees and birds and animals all through there. But one of his little quirks is in almost every room he put an owl. You don't usually find owls in tropical trees with the monkeys and the parrots and all, but that was kind of representative of Reynolds and his base of knowledge and all that. So there's an owl in there somewhere. So beautiful greens and teals and yellows there. In the basement, which became the game room, that was the pirate's den. There's even a bar that's shaped like the bow of a ship. And so again, Reynolds kind of saw himself as a modern-day pirate. And so there's Blackbeard and all these pirates having parties and beach cookouts and all across the walls of the game room. But the room that usually gets the biggest reaction from people is the upstairs ballroom. What had been this elegant, beautiful 1920s ballroom becomes the circus room. And the idea was it was going to be a playroom for his 6 kids. And so they tinted the ceiling with red and white fabric, and Minneboni painted murals all across the walls. Circus characters, circus animals and such. And the story is that there over the fireplace, the ringmaster is Reynolds. The African native you see is supposed to be Bulala, Spalding's head slave who was the overseer. And the strong man next to him was one of Reynolds' contemporaries and one of his overseers. And then the snake charmer lady on the end, that was supposed to be Muriel. Remember wife number 3, the contentious one? And when Muriel saw this, she said, no, we're not having this in the house. So it almost immediately got painted over with blue paint. So for much of the time, it really wasn't these murals, it was blue. And then in the late 1980s, early 1990s, members of the Friends of Sapelo were cleaning the upstairs room, and they started scrubbing at the wall, and the blue paint starts peeling off, and a face appears. And that's when they realized there's something under this blue paint. So all the blue paint was removed, and the murals were restored, and they're incredible. They're a little macabre. It's not a children's circus at all. A little macabre, but they are beautiful paintings up in the circus room. Reynolds built what was known as the Quad. This was a series of buildings, a dairy barn with a theater on the second floor, dormitories and rooms. He created what was known as Plantation Lodge. He actually opened a resort on Sapelo in the 40s and 50s where you could come and be a guest. And in the middle of that, he built what's known as the Turkey Fountain. Can you see the turkeys there on the fountain? Well, again, Muriel hated this. And so they got in a fight one night, and he went over to it, said, you don't like it? Okay, fine. And he went over with, he had cannons because he liked those too. They were used to start the yacht races. Took over a cannon and started shooting the turkeys in the turkey fountain. But it's been rebuilt. So he establishes this, and this actually, after its Plantation Lodge, later on it becomes the center of Ugami's research facilities on the island. So today, in those dorms are scientists and university students from around the world who come to Sapelo to do research there in the Quad. I watched Georgia play Alabama in the national championship in the dairy barn. We were over there to take down Christmas decorations the night of the championship game. So me and the UGA university students are in the dairy barn watching the game. Okay. So Reynolds, again, marine science, maritime history. So he establishes an estuary research center. Do you know what an estuary is? I have a hard time saying it, but it's where the fresh water of a river or stream meets the ocean. It's that brackish water that's in our marsh. What better place to study that than a barrier island like Sapelo, right? And Dr. Eugene Odom had come to visit and to do some research there, and he and Reynolds got together and decided that they need to create an institute. Odom is known as the father of modern ecology, and Dr. John Till in the second picture is also a leading scientist in the area of marine study, wrote a book about life on a barrier island that's very interesting. And I included this picture because a friend of mine, Eric Till, his son, is one of our board members on Friends of Sapelo. So Eric lived on Sapelo with his dad in the early 50s, and he still lives in Darien. The parents went back to Philadelphia, where they were originally from, but Eric still lives here in Darien. So I had to include Dr. Till in my presentation. So Eugene Odom, again, is world famous for his work with ecology and especially with marsh sciences and estuaries and such. And the University of Georgia has the Odom School of Ecology. It is named for him. And they do a lot of research on Sapelo. Like I said, their students come and spend a semester on Sapelo. They stay there at the Quad. And it used to be just graduate students. But then they got this bright idea, hey, let's let the undergraduates come too. And they were supposed to have their first semester here in January of 2020. So the undergraduate kids get here and well, they got quarantined there. I was going to say stuck, but I don't know if being on Sapelo really means being stuck. But they did get quarantined too. So it was quite an interesting first semester of having undergraduates on the island. But again, you have scientific research going on, international exchanges with scientists from around the world come to Sapelo to study this. I met a guy on the ferry one day that was spending 6 months on Sapelo studying bioluminescent fish that glow in the dark. How cool is that? One of the things Friends of Sapelo does, about twice a month, we go out with one of the researchers and we count fish. We pull up a net, we count how many different fish there are, what kinds of fish there are, we drop the net, we pull off somewhere else, we pull up the fish, hey, let's see what's here. So if you like that, talk to me. Then when Reynolds dies, 1964, his widow, Anne Marie, she sells about 2/3 of the island, the north end of the island, to the state of Georgia. Wants to preserve it. And it becomes the Richard J. Reynolds Wildlife Refuge under the Department of Natural Resources, and that's when they established SINAR, the Sapelo Island National Estuary Research Reserve. So protect all this for science research and education. And so it maintains that incredibly beautiful natural environment. By 1976, they had bought the south end of the island from Mrs. Reynolds. And so at this point, the state owns everything but Hog Hammock. They get the north end and the south end. And that really was to protect it. She wanted to make sure that Ugami, the Marine Institute, was protected and never got pushed out by developers and such. She wanted to make sure Hog Hammock was preserved. And so she sells the rest of it to them, all under the SINAR, the Sapelo Island Natural Estuarine Research Reserve. This is the post office at Long Tabby. A lot of times when tour groups come, they will go into the post office, buy a postcard and a stamp, and mail it from there. Sometimes just back to themselves, but then it's stamped and posted from. And the postmistress for Sapelo is the only postmistress in the United States who still takes a ferry to work. She gets on the ferry with her bag of mail and then goes home at the end of the day. So, Hog Hammock. There are still descendants of these African-American slaves living on the island. And I don't know how familiar you are with it. I'm not going to go into a lot of it because it's become very political. But there are still descendants on Hog Hammock. And their culture is declining. They are Geechee. And again, I thought Ugami was that, but no, it's the Geechee. And they are technically Gullah Geechee. But the distinction is the Gullah live on South Carolina islands, the Geechee live on Georgia islands. Okay? And they're doing a lot trying to preserve their culture and their heritage. You have the Ring Shouters. Have you ever seen a performance by the Ring Shouters? They do a festival at Fort Frederica every spring that's just amazing. And the Macintosh Ring Shouters perform all over. And then they did have industry. They had a bakery, a restaurant, a store. Right now, there's still like a little general store, and there's a restaurant, and that's pretty much it for commerce on the island. But they used to have a library. They had a Rosenwald school. Now, the kids on Sapelo take the ferry to Macintosh and get on the bus, go to school, take the bus back, take the last ferry back to the island. And last year, there were like 9 children who left the island to go to school. Basket weaving is a big part of what they do. I meant to bring, I have a coaster that was supposed to be a basket that I made in a class. In fact, the class was here on Jekyll at the campground. Yvonne Grosvenor came over and taught the class, and I was able to make my little coaster. In this top right corner, do y'all know who that is? That is Cornelia Walker Bailey. She was the matriarch of Hog Hammock and of the Geechee culture on Sapelo. Sadly, she passed in October of 2017. I was able to hear her speak in the spring of 2016. Fascinating lady. Wrote a really, really interesting book that I brought with me. God, Dr. Buzzard, and the Bolito Man. Talking about what it's like to grow up Geechee on Sapelo Island. Highly recommend this book. You can find it in most any of the bookstores around here, and definitely at the bookstore at the Visitor Center at Sapelo. But she talks about what it was like from their perspective to grow up on Sapelo. And one of the things that happened is under Reynolds, the African American communities got consolidated into Hog Hammock. And again, there are different stories about how that happened. One of the stories is that Reynolds supplied electricity to Hog Hammock, but not to the other communities. So if you wanted to have electricity in your house, you had to move to Hog Hammock. And that's how he was able to expand his holdings in the other areas. Okay? So it was a way of doing that. And so that is Cornelia Walker Bailey. The store is still there, yes, ma'am. In 1979, President Jimmy Carter visited. That's him with Cornelia. And he actually went to Sapelo quite often. There's a room in the mansion that is referred to as the Carter Suite, because that's where the Carters stayed whenever they were at the mansion. But this is a picture of him there with Cornelia. Okay. There are still active churches on Sapelo today. They still have active communities. And on a Sunday, if you take the ferry over, you're with the people going to church there. Many of the people who have left the island still go back on Sundays. And they don't meet every Sunday. It's usually the second and fourth. But you go over, and because a lot of times we're going over on the last ferry, and they're coming back on the last ferry, and there are huge numbers of people. They go, spend the day, dinner on the ground, the whole bit. Behavior Cemetery is the only African-American cemetery on the island. It's actually the only cemetery on the island, and you have to be full Geechee to be buried there. Okay. Then the South End Mansion gets taken over by Georgia State Parks and Historical Sites and is run today as a conference center and lodge. You can go and stay there. They do lots of weddings, family reunions. They do murder mystery weekends. I mean, what a cool place to have a murder mystery weekend, right? So these are some of my favorite pictures. That's me down in the basement pretending we're in The Shining. We got to wander around through the basement one day, and that was really cool. So these are just some of my favorite pictures of Sapelo. Cabretta Campground, you can go and camp there, primitive camping. One of the things that has happened to Hog Hammock is that they're in the fourth generation of the descendants, and many of them are not interested in living on the island anymore. They have lost contact with that Geechee culture. There's no economic opportunity, and they've sold their land to people who have built Airbnbs. There are lots of places that you can go stay on Sapelo now, like this one up here, and it's just, that's a dying way of life being replaced by this commercial venture of the Airbnbs and the vacation homes and such. And any questions? And my advice to you is to go visit Sapelo Island.